You wake to the sound of distant screams echoing through marble corridors, their desperate voices mixing with the gentle plucking of lute strings and nervous laughter from courtiers. The year is 1520 AD, and you are a servant in the palace of one of Europe's most powerful rulers. Your trembling hands clutch a silver tray as you navigate through chambers where power and perversion dance together in ways that would make the devil himself blush. The air tastes of expensive wine and something darker. Something that makes your stomach churn as you realize the true nature of what happens behind these gilded doors. You pause outside the royal chambers, listening to sounds that no human should make, sounds that speak of appetites so twisted they defy comprehension. When you finally enter, you see tapestries depicting scenes that would make a brothel keeper weep, furniture designed for purposes that have nothing to do with sitting, and implements that bear no resemblance to anything found in a normal household. The smell hits you like a physical force, a mixture of exotic perfumes, bodily fluids, and the metallic scent of fear that clings to everything in this cursed palace. Before diving into these forgotten stories of royal depravity and twisted desires, if you enjoy learning about the darker truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these shocking stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the forbidden chapters of human history. The scene you've just entered is not entirely fictional, but it's not entirely true either. For centuries, whispers have echoed through the halls of European palaces about monarchs whose appetites extended far beyond the normal bounds of royal privilege. These were rulers who transformed their kingdoms into personal playgrounds of sexual excess, who used their absolute power to indulge in fantasies that would horrify even the most depraved minds of their time. Today, we're going to explore the twisted world of history's most perverted monarchs, men and women who wielded ultimate authority not just over their subjects' lives and deaths, but over their bodies in ways that reveal the darkest corners of human nature. These are stories that historians have whispered about in academic corridors, but rarely dared to publish in full detail. Tales that expose how absolute power corrupts not just politically, but sexually, creating monsters who used entire kingdoms as their personal harems. To understand why such extreme behavior was possible, we must first examine the world these monarchs inhabited. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, the concept of royal divine right meant that kings and queens were literally believed to be chosen by God. Their word was law, their desires were commands, and their subjects were property to be used as they saw fit. This created a perfect storm of unlimited power, zero accountability, and access to an endless supply of victims who had no choice but to submit or die. The palace structures themselves were designed to facilitate this abuse. Vast networks of secret passages connected royal chambers to servant quarters, allowing monarchs to move unseen through their domains. Hidden rooms existed behind false walls, soundproof chambers where screams would never be heard. Entire wings of palaces were off limits to all but the most trusted conspirators, creating kingdoms within kingdoms where normal rules of human decency simply did not apply. Our first stop on this journey through royal depravity takes us to the court of King Henry VIII of England, but not the Henry you learned about in school. Yes, he had 6 wives and executed 2 of them, but those were just the publicly acknowledged relationships. Behind palace doors, Henry maintained what can only be described as a sexual reign of terror that lasted for decades and claimed hundreds of victims whose names history has forgotten. Henry's transformation from the athletic young king who ascended the throne in 1509 to the bloated monster of his later years was not just physical, but psychological. As his body deteriorated from what historians now believe was a combination of diabetes, syphilis, and various other ailments, his sexual appetites became increasingly twisted and violent. The king, who had once been content with discreet affairs, began demanding more extreme forms of gratification that pushed the boundaries of what even his most loyal courtiers could stomach. The royal household records, carefully coded to hide their true meaning, reveal a pattern of behavior that would make modern criminal investigators sick. Young women would disappear from court with alarming regularity, officially dismissed for various minor infractions, but actually vanishing into Henry's private chambers, never to be seen again. Servant girls, daughters of minor nobles, even visiting dignitaries' wives found themselves summoned to the king's presence for activities that went far beyond normal royal entertainment. Henry's methods were as calculated as they were cruel. He would begin by showering his targets with gifts and attention, making them feel special and chosen. Then came the isolation, separating them from family and friends under various pretexts. Finally came the horror, as these women discovered that refusing the king meant not just losing their positions, but potentially losing their lives. The king's personal chambers during this period were equipped with devices that served no purpose other than to inflict pain and humiliation. Chains and restraints were built into the very architecture of certain rooms, disguised as decorative elements, but serving far more sinister purposes. Servants tasked with cleaning these chambers reported finding evidence of activities so disturbing that many requested transfers to other parts of the palace, even at the cost of their careers. What makes Henry's case particularly chilling is how he managed to maintain his public image while conducting these private horrors. He understood that his subjects needed to see him as a strong, virile king defending England's interests, so he carefully compartmentalized his public and private personas. During the day, he would hold court, make important political decisions, and present himself as the ideal Renaissance monarch. At night, he became something else entirely, a predator who used his absolute power to satisfy appetites that grew more twisted with each passing year. The psychological profile that emerges from contemporary accounts is that of a man who had never been told no in his entire life, gradually discovering that normal human relationships could not satisfy his need for complete domination. As his power grew more absolute, his ability to relate to other people as equals disappeared entirely. Everyone in his kingdom existed solely for his pleasure, and he saw no moral distinction between using a subject's labor for building castles and using their body for his sexual gratification. But Henry VIII was far from unique in the annals of royal perversion. Across Europe, other monarchs were conducting their own experiments in absolute sexual power, each finding new ways to combine political authority with carnal appetite. In France, King Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, created what can only be described as a sexual pyramid scheme that reached into every corner of his magnificent palace at Versailles. While history remembers him for his political absolutism and architectural achievements, the truth about his private appetites reveals a man who turned the entire French court into an elaborate system for procuring and organizing sexual encounters that defied both Christian morality and basic human decency. The elaborate court rituals at Versailles, which historians have long celebrated as examples of refined civilization, served a far darker purpose than mere ceremony. The complex hierarchy of access to the king, the intricate dance of favor and disfavor, the carefully orchestrated social calendar, all of these were designed not just to maintain political control, but to create a constant supply of willing and unwilling participants in Louis's increasingly elaborate sexual fantasies. The king's daily routine, known as the lever, involved dozens of nobles competing for the privilege of watching him dress and attending to his personal needs. But this public ceremony was merely the acceptable face of a much more sinister private ritual. Selected courtiers, both male and female, were required to attend private levers in the king's personal apartments, ceremonies that bore no resemblance to their public counterparts, and involved forms of service that would have scandalized even the most libertine members of French society. Louis understood that sexual submission was the ultimate form of political control. By forcing his nobles to participate in or witness his perversions, he created a court where everyone was complicit in his crimes, where no one could challenge his authority without exposing their own participation in activities that would destroy their reputations and potentially cost them their lives. This web of mutual blackmail became the foundation of his absolute monarchy, more effective than any army or law in maintaining his grip on power. The private apartments of Versailles contained rooms that served purposes no architect would ever admit to designing. Hidden chambers accessed through concealed doors in the king's bedroom housed collections of devices and furniture that existed solely to facilitate increasingly elaborate and degrading sexual encounters. Servants who maintained these rooms were sworn to secrecy on pain of death, and many chose exile or suicide rather than continue witnessing what transpired in those hidden spaces. The psychological toll on Louis's victims was devastating and systematic. The king developed methods for breaking down his target's resistance that revealed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. He would begin by isolating individuals from their support networks, then gradually introduce them to increasingly extreme activities under the guise of royal privilege and divine right. Those who resisted found their families threatened, their fortunes confiscated, their very lives hanging by threads. What makes Louis's case particularly disturbing is how he weaponized the religious beliefs of his time to justify his actions. As a king chosen by God, he argued, his desires were inherently holy, his appetites divinely inspired. He forced court chaplains to provide theological justification for acts that violated every principle of Christian morality, creating a perverted theology that transformed rape into religious duty and torture into sacred ritual. Moving across the continent to Russia, we encounter Empress Catherine II, known to history as Catherine the Great, whose sexual appetites were legendary even in her own time, but whose true depravities remained hidden behind carefully crafted propaganda about enlightened rule and cultural achievement. The woman who expanded Russian territory and patronized the arts was also a predator whose abuse of power extended into realms that would shock even modern sensibilities. Catherine's court in St. Petersburg operated under a veneer of European sophistication that masked activities that would have made barbarian chieftains recoil in horror. The Empress understood that her position as a woman in power required her to be twice as ruthless and 3 times as depraved as her male counterparts to maintain control over a nobility that questioned her legitimacy from the moment she seized the throne from her husband. The Empress developed what she called philosophical salons, gatherings supposedly dedicated to discussing Enlightenment ideas and cultural refinement. In reality, these salons were carefully orchestrated orgies where participation was mandatory for anyone seeking advancement at court. Catherine would preside over these gatherings from a throne-like chair, directing activities that combined intellectual discourse with physical degradation in ways that left participants psychologically shattered and completely under her control. Her private chambers contained a library of books that had nothing to do with philosophy or statecraft. Instead, these volumes contained detailed descriptions and illustrations of sexual practices from around the world, techniques for inflicting pain while maintaining pleasure, methods for breaking human will while preserving physical beauty. Catherine studied these texts with the same dedication she applied to matters of state, treating sexual domination as another form of political science. As you stand once more in those marble corridors, the echoes of history's darkest secrets still reverberating through ancient stone, you realize that the true horror was never the individual acts of these twisted monarchs, but how easily absolute power transforms human beings into monsters. From Henry's chambers of torment to Louis's pyramid of sexual control, from Catherine's philosophical degradation to countless other rulers whose names history has mercifully forgotten, we see the same pattern repeated across centuries and continents. Power without accountability doesn't just corrupt, it destroys the very essence of humanity, turning those who wield it into predators and those beneath them into prey. These stories remind us that behind every golden crown and magnificent palace lay shadows, where the worst of human nature flourished unchecked. The lesson echoes through time, that when we place any individual above the basic laws of human decency, we create not gods among men, but demons wearing crowns. Perhaps the most disturbing truth is that these weren't aberrations or exceptions, but the inevitable result of systems that placed unlimited power in the hands of mortals who forgot they were human. The palaces still stand, their secrets buried in stone and silence, but the warning remains as relevant today as it was 5 centuries ago.